December 5th, 1936. Before dawn, Wallis Simpson steps into a car outside Fort Belvedere, the Gothic country house in Windsor Great Park where Edward had made his home, and begins the long drive south toward France. Lord Brownlow, the king's own lord-in-waiting, sits beside her. The British press has just broken the silence they'd maintained since summer. By morning, the story is on every front page in London. By the time they reach the English Channel, foreign journalists are already converging on the south of France. She is heading for the Villa Lou Viei, near Cannes, the home of her close friends Herman and Katherine Rogers, where she'll spend the next 3 months under effective siege. The house sits above the Mediterranean. It sounds idyllic. Reporters camped at the gates made certain it wasn't. Wallis read their coverage from inside, receiving what biographer Anne Sebba later documented as alarming letters threatening her life, including bomb warnings. Scotland Yard had been following her for months. She was receiving hate mail from the British public by the sack. At the tearful departure from Fort Belvedere, Edward had told her he would never give her up. She was terrified. That terror is the part the legend leaves out. And it's where this story actually starts. The version of this story most people know goes something like this. Wallis Simpson was an American socialite, calculating, seductive, twice divorced, who attached herself to the heir to the British throne, then leveraged his obsession to position herself for the crown. The British establishment resisted. Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication on December 10, 1936, at Fort Belvedere, witnessed by his 3 surviving brothers, Albert, Henry, and George. He had reigned for 325 days. He went into exile. Wallis got what she wanted: the ring, the title, the love story. The monarchy lost a king. The country lost its dignity. Wallis Simpson won. That's the story. Biographies repeated it. Films dramatized it. When The Crown premiered on Netflix on November 4, 2016, its 10-episode first season carried the story of Edward choosing Wallis over duty and crown to a vast global audience. One popular culture ranking placed her alongside Cruella de Vil and Snow White's evil stepmother in the catalog of female villains. Even people who've never read a word about the abdication know her name as shorthand for dangerous ambition. In Alexander Larman's formulation in The Spectator in November 2024, the Wallis template gets reapplied whenever an American woman marries into the British royal family and the husband subsequently leaves, a template that assigns agency to the woman and absolution to the man. That's the template's function. There is a problem with it. Wallis wrote letters, a lot of them, and when those letters were finally read by people who weren't looking for love poetry, they told a different story. Not a romantic revision, not a rehabilitation into sainthood, but something more honest. The record of a woman who saw the catastrophe coming, tried to stop it, and found herself trapped first by a man who wouldn't be dissuaded, and then by his decision for the rest of her life. The letters have been published. They've been reviewed by the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. They've been quoted by biographers and broadcast on Channel 4. The villain narrative barely moved. Understanding why is what this is actually about. The legend required a specific Wallis, hungry for the crown, ruthless enough to wreck a constitutional monarchy, patient enough to manage a king. The British press, which had maintained a self-imposed silence about the relationship since the summer of 1936, had a particular problem when the story finally broke in December. They'd been sitting on it for months, while American and European papers ran it openly. Through most of 1936, while Edward openly holidayed with Wallis in the eastern Mediterranean, and her name appeared regularly in the court circular, British domestic readers saw nothing. Foreign press, however, reported everything. Liberty magazine called her the Yankee at King Edward's court. In Portland, Oregon, students launched a Simpson for Queen campaign. In France, Paris Soir's edition of October 28th announced, "Press and radio in the United States announce Edward VIII's marriage to an American." British readers had no access to any of it through domestic outlets. Imported foreign titles were intercepted at ports or censored with scissors by distributors who feared libel proceedings. The architecture of the silence was built from deference and self-interest. Lord Beaverbrook, whose Daily Express led British newspaper circulation, had personally welcomed Edward's request to protect Wallis from sensational publicity. Geoffrey Dawson, editor of The Times, visited Downing Street, aligned himself with Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin's view that the marriage would appall the electorate, and held the line. The Morning Post's editor wrote to Baldwin directly, "In such a delicate matter as this, the press should follow the government and not dictate to it." A secret archive of annotated American and French press clippings, found decades later in the executive suite of the Kent Messenger Group, bound in brown paper and labeled in handwriting, undisturbed for decades, established that senior British editors had detailed knowledge of the relationship all year. They chose not to report it. The dam finally broke on December 1st, when Alfred Blunt, Bishop of Bradford, delivered a speech at his diocesan conference expressing hope that the king was aware of his need for divine grace. The press took that mild expression of religious concern as tacit permission to publish what they'd known since summer. Within a week, the country had gone from total ignorance to the king's abdication. The shock of that transition, 10 months of silence, then a constitutional crisis in 7 days, required a story that explained it. Wallis, as scheming architect, made the press's silence look protective. Wallis, as calculating villain, made their eventual coverage look like a responsible response to a genuine threat. The alternative, that they'd known about a king's relationship for nearly a year and chosen, for reasons of institutional deference and self-interest, to say nothing, reflected worse on everyone. When the embargo broke, Neville Chamberlain, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, wrote in his diary that she was an entirely unscrupulous woman who wasn't in love with the king, but was exploiting him for her own purposes. Scotland Yard's special branch, which had followed Wallis for months, opening her letters and monitoring her phone calls, concluded in their reports that she and Ernest Simpson were a pair of professional hustlers, preying on the prince for money. The king's equerry reportedly told colleagues Wallis would eventually leave Edward, having secured the cash. Archbishop Cosmo Gordon Lang announced after the abdication that Edward had chosen a companion who, in the end, couldn't strengthen and fortify him. These were the voices that reached the public in December 1936. Wallis was in a villa in southern France, behind closed gates, reading bomb threats. Her voice didn't make it into the December coverage. Not then, and not for 50 years. She was, however, writing hundreds of letters during the crisis months. To Edward, to her second husband Ernest Simpson, to friends. The question is what those letters actually said, and whether the people who eventually read them were willing to hear it. The first collection reached print in 1986. Michael Bloch, born in 1953, had trained as a lawyer and from 1979 worked for Maître Suzanne Blum, the Parisian lawyer who had managed the Duke and Duchess of Windsor's estate. In 1975, the Duchess had instructed Blum to allow the letters and other documents from the Duke's archive to be made available. Bloch spent 6 years working through the Windsor archives in Paris, producing 6 books about the couple, including The Duke of Windsor's War, Operation Viei, and The Secret File of the Duke of Windsor. In April 1986, 2 days after Wallis died, the Los Angeles Times announced that the letters had been entrusted to Bloch. Wallis and Edward, Letters 1931 to 1937, appeared from Weidenfeld and Nicholson, a 320-page collection of correspondence that had passed primarily between Wallis and Edward from the year they first met until the year they married. The letters were intimate. Wallis called Edward by his family nickname, David, the last of his 7 baptismal names, the one only his family and closest friends used. The Duke signed some letters using the private monogram W.E., joining the first letters of Wallis and Edward, a detail also engraved on the emerald ring he gave her at their engagement, along with the words, "We are ours now." The New York Times reviewed the Bloch collection on June 29, 1986. The verdict? The book reveals no dark secrets, and it supports the paused, incomplete in the surviving citation, but the framing is telling. The Times was looking for dark secrets. They found love letters. They received the collection as romance documentation, not as evidence of anything. That reception tells you something important. The letters were published and reviewed at the highest levels of mainstream press, and nobody treated them as challenging the villain narrative. The question of Wallis's actual role in the crisis wasn't the frame anyone brought to reading them. They were presented as supplementary material to a story already agreed upon, not as primary evidence that might revise it. After the Duke's death in 1972, the originals had been transported under irregular circumstances from the Bois de Boulogne to Windsor, a phrase used in the source record without elaboration. The provenance gap has never been fully explained, and Bloch's own position deserves noting. He worked directly for the Windsor estate's lawyer from 1979 onward, the same legal structure that controlled access to the papers. Reviewers noted his defense of them based not on sentiment, but simply on truth. That framing, sympathetic by design, vetted by the estate, was baked into the collection's editorial structure. The Bloch letters are a legitimate primary source, but they aren't an independent one. Then, in 2011, a second archive surfaced with different provenance, and this one is considerably harder to dismiss. Anne Sebba, researching her 2011 biography, That Woman, The Life of Wallis Simpson, Duchess of Windsor, found 15 unpublished letters written by Wallis to Ernest Simpson. The letters dated from 1936 to 1937. They were found in an attic. They arrived in their original envelopes with verifiable postmarks. Channel 4 aired a documentary revealing the contents. The Times noted that Wallis's attempts to pull out of the marriage were already documented, but said the 15 letters suggested her reticence may have been driven by a continued emotional attachment to Ernest. Ernest Simpson is the crucial figure here, and he's usually cast as a footnote. He was a British-American shipping executive and former officer in the Coldstream Guards, quiet and steady, a man who remarried within months of his divorce from Wallis being finalized. He had no role in the abdication's political machinery. He had no power to protect Wallis's reputation. He couldn't advance her position. She had left him, wronged him, traded their marriage for something she wasn't even sure she wanted. He was the last person on earth she needed to perform victimhood for. These weren't letters written for posterity. They were letters from a frightened woman to the man who had been, by her own later account, the stable center of her previous life. 2 extracts from those letters have been verified by multiple independent sources. The first, written during autumn 1936 as the crisis was building, "I am terrified of the court, etc. I feel small and licked by it all." The second, from the same period, "What can I say when I am standing beside the grave of everything that was us?" Read those lines in the context of the received history, the calculating socialite who maneuvered a king off his throne, and something doesn't fit. A woman positioning herself for a crown doesn't write like this to her discarded ex-husband. She doesn't describe herself as licked by the institution she supposedly wanted to rule. She doesn't describe her previous life as something she is standing beside the grave of. These aren't the words of someone who believed she was winning. The Seba archive also documented a specific episode from November 30th, 1936, 10 days before the abdication. Wallis wrote to Ernest that she was planning to escape. Not metaphorically. She had a plan. She would tell Edward she was going out to look for hats, a cover story she'd apparently used before, a domestic errand plausible enough to get her out of the house. Once clear of him, she wouldn't come back. The reason she needed the deception, the reason she couldn't simply announce she was leaving. Edward had threatened suicide if she left him. That detail is the answer to the implicit counter-argument that follows every discussion of Wallis's distress letters. The argument goes, if she didn't want the abdication, she could have left. She was a resourceful woman. Nobody was physically preventing her departure. If she wrote to Ernest about wanting to escape, why didn't she just go? The answer, from Seba's research, is that by late November 1936, she was trapped by the specific nature of Edward's obsession. His biographer, Philip Ziegler, described him as having become slavishly dependent on Wallis. Scotland Yard operatives monitoring their relationship throughout the year concluded that his devotion had become total and obsessive. A man in that state, issuing suicide threats, isn't easily abandoned. He was the King of England. He had people watching both of them. The cover story about hats wasn't theatrical. It was the pragmatic calculation of a woman trying to get out of a situation without triggering a collapse she would then be blamed for either way. She didn't get out. Edward discovered the plan or preempted it, or simply refused to let her go. The abdication proceeded. The most detailed account of the pivotal moment, when the word abdication passed between them for the first time, comes from Anna Pasternak's 2019 book, The Real Wallis Simpson, drawn from Wallis's own written recollection. It's worth following closely because the scene reveals something the standard narrative buries. November 16th, 1936. Edward has returned from his second meeting with Stanley Baldwin at Buckingham Palace. Baldwin had made the government's position clear. The country wouldn't accept Wallis as queen consort, and if Edward insisted on marrying her against his minister's advice, the government would resign. Edward has already told Baldwin, "I intend to marry Mrs. Simpson as soon as she is free to marry. If the government opposed the marriage, I was prepared to go." He returns to Wallis and tells her what he's decided. She reads the letter from Alec Harding, the king's private secretary, that has been lying in wait for her, a formal warning that the press silence was about to break and that the government wouldn't support the marriage. She reads it and goes numb. Her later account, preserved by Pasternak. This was the end I had always known in the back of my mind was bound to come. She turns to Edward and tells him her departure would be in everyone's best interests. She has to leave. Edward's response, as recorded in his wife's account, "You'll do no such thing. I won't have it. This letter is an impertinence." She pushes back. She tells him the government is serious. He tells her they can't stop him. She tells him to let her go. His answer, stated directly to her face and confirmed in multiple sources as his actual position at the time, "On the throne or off, I'm going to marry you." At that point, by Wallis's own account, preserved by Pasternak from her written recollection, now it was my turn to beg him to let me go. Summoning all the powers of persuasion in my possession, I tried to convince him of the hopelessness of our position. For him to go on hoping, to go on fighting the inevitable, could only mean tragedy for him and catastrophe for me. Edward's response to the begging. He took her hand, and told her he was going to summon Baldwin to the palace. He was going to tell the Prime Minister that if the country wouldn't approve of their marrying, he was ready to go. At that, the first mention of abdication between them, not as a rumor or a theoretical possibility, but as his stated intention, Wallis burst into tears. Pasternak's own judgment on the dynamic, stated directly in the Town and Country excerpt. Surely, the greater act of love would have been for Edward to let Wallis go. Yet he didn't seem to be able to see matters from any other perspective than his own. She also noted that Wallis later reproached herself, rather than Edward, for being deflected from her decision to leave immediately, describing that moment as the fateful moment, the last when any action of mine could have prevented the crisis. That last line carries a particular weight. Wallis blamed herself for not leaving. She didn't blame Edward for not letting her. It's a pattern that runs through everything she wrote. The accountability falling back on the woman, even in her own private reckoning. One additional note on Edward's agency. The abdication crisis occurred against the backdrop of a documented ambivalence about the monarchy that predated Wallis by 16 years. In a letter to his then-mistress, Freda Dudley Ward, dated April 28, 1920, Edward wrote, "Each day, I long more and more to chuck this job and be out of it." Wallis didn't give Edward an excuse to leave. She gave a convenient narrative to a departure he had been inclined towards since he was 25. The letters were published in 1986, reviewed in major newspapers, and the villain narrative barely moved. The reasons why begin with a clear-eyed look at who needed it. The institutional interests weren't accidental. They aligned with striking efficiency. Edward's legacy was the first thing at stake. If Wallis had engineered the abdication, if she was the calculating operator who leveraged a susceptible king, then Edward was a romantic hero who chose love over duty. The sacrifice reads as noble. If, on the other hand, Wallis was terrified and trying to leave, and Edward overrode her repeatedly because his obsession had passed the point of reason, then Edward becomes something considerably harder to celebrate. Not a romantic hero. A man whose compulsion destroyed 2 lives and a constitutional monarchy, and who couldn't, or wouldn't, hear the woman he claimed to love telling him to stop. His own letters, post-abdication, aren't the words of a man at peace. Writing from Paris, "Wallis and I get pretty desperate here at times." He signed a letter to Wallis shortly after the abdication with, "God bless we, my Wallis. You know your David will." The private monogram, the family nickname, the conditional trailing off. He spent the rest of his life petitioning the royal family to grant Wallis the HRH. She was, by several accounts, less concerned about the title than he was. He needed the title to justify what he had done. She needed it because without it, she was permanently marked. The royal family had complementary reasons to maintain the existing framing. George VI, the reluctant king, Bertie, the man with the stammer who rose to demands he never anticipated, is one of the 20th century's most sympathetic royal figures. His legacy depends on the poignancy of his accession. He was thrust onto the throne by his brother's choices, steadied the nation through the war, managed the transition out of empire with dignity, and died prematurely. The story requires an external cause for his kingship, a manipulator who forced the crisis, to give his sacrifice its heroic dimension. If the cause was internal to the family, if Edward's compulsion rather than Wallis's manipulation produced the abdication, then George VI's reign begins not as a call to unexpected duty, but as the consequence of a family's inability to manage one of its members. The press, meanwhile, needed the villain narrative to justify 10 months of deliberate silence. Professor Tim Luckhurst of Durham University, examining the archival record in a 2022 essay, concluded flatly that The timidity of powerful proprietors ensured that newspapers failed utterly. They'd known. They'd chosen not to say so. Framing Wallis as a dangerous operator made that silence look like protection rather than complicity. A Tatler essay on the double standard observed with precise economy. Edward chose Wallis, and that choice, his choice, became her crime. The Spectator's November 2024 piece noted that the comparison between Wallis and Meghan Markle has become shorthand for the historically illiterate and lazy. Both American, both married to a British royal, both apparently responsible for their husband's departure from established royal life. Both cases apply the same reductive template. The male choice becomes the female influence. The man's decision becomes the woman's manipulation. It has been useful twice now, and it works the same way both times. Queen Elizabeth, born Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, who became the Queen Consort in December 1936, and the Queen Mother after 1952, held what was, functionally, the most personally motivated grievance of anyone involved in the abdication's aftermath. And she acted on it for 50 years. Her husband Albert, George VI, had not been prepared for kingship. He was a gentle, shy man with a severe stammer that worsened dramatically under the public pressure of the throne. He had not wanted the role. He was compelled into it by his brother's choices. He died on February 6, 1952, aged 56, following a lung operation. Multiple sources confirm the Queen Mother attributed his shortened life directly to the stress of his unexpected reign combined with the Second World War. The abdication had made that reign unavoidable. Wallis Simpson was the woman around whom the entire sequence had rotated. Her grief had a face, and she didn't keep the grief private. Michael Thornton, who wrote Royal Feud, The Queen Mother and the Duchess of Windsor, and who met both women privately over the years, left the most vivid first-hand account available of what the Queen Mother's hostility actually looked like in practice. At a luncheon at Clarence House, liveried footmen standing behind every chair, the Queen Mother performed a detailed impression of Wallis at Balmoral in 1936. Adopting what Thornton described as an unmistakably harsh Baltimorean accent, she mimicked Wallis's supposed commentary on the castle's decor. "This tartan's gotta go. I just have to do this place over." By Thornton's account, nobody listening would have thought the Queen Mother lacked a sense of humor. The performance was hilarious. It was also, decades after the events, contempt maintained with the energy of fresh injury. When Thornton raised the abdication directly at a different meeting, the Queen Mother went quieter. She lifted her hand to stop him mid-sentence. "You know, it's something I never talk about, because it was all so dreadful at the time. It was a tragedy, because he used to be such fun before she came along." A pause. Then, "Love does strange things to people. I am afraid the truth is that at that time, he was rather more than a little mad." Subject closed. The practiced nature of that evasion, the deflection to Edward's mental state, the implicit placement of blame on Wallis, while technically speaking about Edward, is itself a kind of technique. She never said Wallis's name in that exchange. She never had to. In documentary and archival evidence, the hostility was considerably less veiled. A letter exists in which the Queen Mother described Wallis as the lowest of the low, a thoroughly immoral woman. The same source notes a second Queen Mother letter, written shortly after that one, and removed from the archives. A Royalty magazine archival piece reported this removal without elaboration. If accurate, it suggests not passive neglect of the historical record, but active management of what future readers would find. The story the Queen Mother told about Wallis was, like all such stories, partially constructed. Her practical tools for sustaining the narrative were more powerful than letters. King George VI issued the letters patent of May 27, 1937, 7 days before the wedding, explicitly denying Wallis the style of Her Royal Highness. When Edward received the news, his reported reaction? "This is a nice wedding present." The mechanism required a legally dubious construction. Under established royal practice and British common law, a wife automatically takes her husband's rank. When Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had married the Duke of York, she had become Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. Wallis was owed the same by every relevant precedent. To deny it, George VI's lawyers had to construct a fiction that Edward had forfeited all royal rank upon abdicating, allowing the new king to restore it with restrictions. Burke's peerage later described the denial as the most flagrant act of discrimination in the whole history of their dynasty. The Duke of Windsor spent the next 35 years petitioning for his wife's HRH. Every petition failed. Queen Elizabeth II denied the title even at Edward's deathbed. It was his dying wish. It was refused. A Channel 5 documentary asserted that the denial was driven principally by the new queen consort's personal influence, that it was her decision wearing George VI's signature. A BBC Two documentary featured a historian's characterization of her treatment of Wallis as vindictive, vicious. The Queen Mother herself, speaking to Thornton at the Clarence House luncheon, declined to deny the exile charge directly. When the suggestion was raised that she had been instrumental in condemning the Windsors to France, she smiled and said, almost absently, "A country can only have one king at a time." The Duke of Windsor, sitting with Thornton in the blue and gold drawing room of the Bois de Boulogne mansion in 1971, months before his diagnosis with inoperable throat cancer, described his sister-in-law with precision. "Behind that great abundance of charm is a shrewd, scheming, and extremely ruthless woman," he added, with one of his most practiced smiles. But of course you can't quote that. The sisters-in-law met in person 3 times in the 35 years between the abdication and the Duke's death. Once in 1966 at the unveiling of a plaque to Queen Mary in the Mall. Banks of cameras, a long and uncomfortable handshake, Wallis pointedly declining to curtsy to a crowned and anointed queen. Once at Edward's funeral in 1972, when the Queen Mother took Wallis by the arm and murmured, "I know how you feel. I've been through it myself." Then she kissed Wallis on the cheek. Courtiers were astonished. And once, in 1976, a planned Queen Mother visit to Wallis in Paris was cancelled on medical advice. The Duchess was by then suffering from dementia. From the British Embassy, the Queen Mother sent her page with a basket of roses and a card in her own handwriting. It read, "In friendship, Elizabeth." In friendship, after 50 years. The roses arrived. The card probably didn't mean what it said, but it was the last word in that particular correspondence. The physical record of the denial stands at Frogmore in Berkshire, where both are buried. His gravestone? His Royal Highness, the Prince Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, Duke of Windsor. Hers, Wallis, Duchess of Windsor. 2 stones, placed side by side, the hierarchy still carved into stone. His royal standing is permanent. Hers was never restored, by anyone, at any point. The public image that survived into the 1950s and 1960s was the Windsors as the most glamorous exile in Europe, the house in Paris, the seasons in Antibes, the best-dressed woman in the world holding her dinners at the Bois de Boulogne mansion, while her husband wore his Windsor knot and his regrets in approximately equal measure. The image was real enough as far as it went. It just didn't go very far. On December 1st, 1948, 12 years after the abdication, 12 years into the life she had supposedly engineered, Wallis sat down and wrote an 8-page letter to a close friend she addressed as Dear Gray, believed to be Grace, Countess of Dudley. The letter recently emerged for sale at Chiswick Auctions in London, estimated at £7,000, and the auction house specialist described it as giving a fascinating glimpse of what her mood was at the time. The mood wasn't triumphant. At the time of writing, the couple had been living at Le Croix, their villa in Antibes on the French Riviera, the place where, by Wallis's account, the winters were ideal, and the social life, for those who wanted that particular social life, was exactly right. The Duke wanted Paris. He wanted the city, a proper house, proximity to what passed for official life. So they were moving. Wallis writes about signing the lease on a property in the city. Her description: a gloomy, dark house in the narrowest part of that street and a garage opposite. She laments not having bought a different house when she could, back when they'd lived there before. When I had spent a bit and all was installed, and the price had since tripled. She writes about blocked capital, financial constraints that prevented them from living as they were accustomed to. She writes about missing Le Croix. And then she writes for several pages about Herman and Katherine Rogers, the friends who had sheltered her during the abdication crisis in 1936, at whose villa in Cannes she had been besieged by journalists for 3 months, and who remain the emotional center of the letter in a way the Duke, mentioned once, does not. Katherine Rogers was dying of throat cancer. Herman was watching her die. Wallis writes about their situation with a tenderness she doesn't apply to anyone else in the letter. He thinks it would make Kay very happy and would of course be a godsend to Herman, who really never has a moment. It's too tragic, but they are determined to lick this thing. I haven't seen H alone, so don't really know how hopeful he is. The letter is signed Wallis Windsor and addressed across 8 handwritten pages to a friend who might understand. The Duke's name appears once. Andrew Morton, in Wallis in Love, drew on notes made by the ghostwriter hired to produce Wallis's 1956 memoir, The Heart Has Its Reasons, and concluded that Herman Rogers, the man who appears across several pages of that 1948 letter, while her husband rates a single mention, may have been the person Wallis genuinely loved. A confession that, by Morton's account, Wallis specifically asked the ghostwriter to omit from the published memoir. The memoir was a careful document. The 1948 letter wasn't. The auction specialist at Chiswick summarized the letter's emotional register with professional understatement. She doesn't sound too happy. Edward, writing from the same Paris existence a few years earlier, had been equally candid to a correspondent. Wallis and I get pretty desperate here, at times. The romance of the century, put plainly by both participants. Hugo Vickers, whose 2011 book, Behind Closed Doors, The Tragic Untold Story of the Duchess of Windsor, examined the exile years in detail, traced the Duchess through to the very end. After Edward's death on May 28, 1972, she returned to Paris as his widow. The Guardian's summary of Vickers's research is brief and accurate. She began the decline that ended with her own death in 1986. During this period, she became ever more reclusive. The gilded socialite image, the hostess, the wit, the fashion icon, dissolved in the years after Edward died. She rarely appeared in public. The mansion at the Bois de Boulogne, full of the accumulated objects of 50 years of deliberate exile, became effectively a prison. The final stage of that imprisonment was administered by Maître Suzanne Blum, the same Parisian lawyer who had granted Michael Bloch access to the Windsor archive, who had managed the estate through the Duchess's last decade. A Historical Novel Society review of the Vickers book noted that Blum and her associates allegedly isolated the Duchess from most of her friends, sold off possessions with a possibly forged letter granting Bloom power of attorney. The woman who had supposedly seized everything ended her life with her affairs managed by someone else, cut off from the people she trusted, inside the house she'd described 37 years earlier as gloomy dark. Wallis died on April 24, 1986, 89 years old. She was buried 5 days later at Frogmore, beside the Duke, in the royal burial ground, the place she'd been denied access to as a living royal for the entirety of their marriage. She left behind a line that appears in collected quotations attributed to her. The context of its utterance isn't recorded, but the line itself has the quality of something said out loud after long private thought. "You have no idea how hard it's to live out a great romance." Whatever the circumstances of its first delivery, it functions as the most precise account available of what the abdication actually cost her. Not the title, not the access, not the official standing, but the decades of performance required to inhabit the story someone else had written for her. The performative victimhood objection deserves a full answer because it's a legitimate one. Private letters are always self-edited documents. Wallis Simpson was exceptionally intelligent, highly socially sophisticated, and by autumn 1936, acutely aware that she was a figure of historic consequence. Scotland Yard was following her. Her letters were being intercepted. Foreign newspapers were tracking her movements. She had to know she was living inside an episode that historians would examine for a century. Sophisticated people with that level of awareness sometimes write for posterity, even when they appear to be writing for an audience of one. The possibility that her letters to Edward, in which she reportedly urged him to let her disappear, according to the Bloch collection's own descriptive summary, were partly crafted to establish a paper trail, to ensure the record would eventually show her as the reluctant party, isn't paranoid speculation. It's a reasonable thing to raise. The objection lands with considerably less force against the Seba archive. Ernest Simpson wasn't a player in the constitutional machinery. He couldn't protect Wallis's reputation or advance her position. She had left him for another man, disrupted his life, ended their marriage. He remarried a friend of hers within months of the divorce. He had every reason to resent her. She had no reason to perform for him. If she was curating her image in those 15 letters, she was doing so for an audience of one, with no ability to help her, and plenty of reasons to be unsympathetic. The fear, the longing, the cover story about searching for hats, these read as the pragmatic, frightened communications of a person in genuine distress, not as image management. The honest assessment of what the letters prove is narrower than the title's most dramatic reading. No verbatim line has been found in which Wallis writes to Edward, "Don't abdicate." That specific phrasing, the cleanest version of the hook, does not appear in the available primary record. What the letters establish instead is something more specific, and in some ways more damning. A contemporaneous record of a woman who described herself as terrified, who attempted to escape using a deceptive cover story, who was prevented from doing so by a man threatening suicide, who wrote to her ex-husband mourning her previous life, and who described in her own words, preserved by Pasternak from her written recollection, the moment of actively begging Edward to let her go, and his refusal. The evidence doesn't produce an exoneration. Wallis had sharp elbows. The Spectator's Larman, reading through the Bloch letters for his own research, found a keen appreciation of money and status that many would find distasteful, even grasping. She had been a willing participant in the relationship for years before the crisis. These facts are real. The letters don't erase them, but the specific accusation at the center of the villain narrative, that she wanted the crown, engineered the abdication, and was the architect of the constitutional crisis, runs directly contrary to what the contemporaneous letters establish. The evidence supports a narrower, more honest conclusion. She didn't want it, she tried to stop it, she couldn't, and the reasons she couldn't illuminate the real driver of the abdication far more clearly than the received history does. That's what Wallis left in writing. Not in the carefully produced memoir published in 1956, which millions read, and which she had specifically asked be edited to remove the most revealing truth about her feelings, but in the private notes she sent when the crisis was actually happening, to the ex-husband she'd abandoned, in letters found in an attic in 2011, in original envelopes with original postmarks. Not drafting for posterity, writing, in the particular compressed shorthand of real distress, to someone who would understand what she was actually describing. The letters were published in 1986, reviewed in major newspapers, examined again in 2011 when the Seba archive surfaced, broadcast on Channel 4. Anne Sebba's book was discussed and quoted. Michael Bloch's collection sits on library shelves. Anna Pasternak's 2019 account drew directly on Wallis's own recollection of the pivotal conversations. None of it substantially moved the villain narrative, because the villain was, and remains, too useful to surrender. Edward's choice became her crime because someone needed to bear the blame for a crisis that implicated everyone. The royal family needed an external architect to keep Edward romantic and George VI's reign heroic. The Queen Mother needed a target for 50 years of grief she couldn't publicly express any other way. The British press needed a retrospective justification for 10 months of deliberate, institutionally convenient silence. The story required Wallis to be the woman who wanted the crown, so that everyone else could be something more complicated. She didn't want it. She said so, in writing to a man she had no reason to impress, in letters that survived 70 years in an attic before anyone read them carefully. Nobody had to destroy those letters. It was enough to read them and call them love letters, to treat them as romance documentation rather than testimony, to file them under biography rather than evidence, to review them as revealing no dark secrets, and move on to the next story about a woman who broke a monarchy. The villain was more useful than the truth. It still is. Subscribe for more stories like this.